so much for coming. It's very nice to see some familiar faces out there. My name is Caitlin Hudgens. I am an English professor here at Potomac State College, and this is a great crowd. So I just wanted to give you guys a little bit of a background about how this happened and who we will be hearing from tonight. So back in October, I saw an announcement in my email about a walking tour for Frederick Douglass and his involvement in Cumberland. And I thought that would be the perfect opportunity for my students to see, well, so number one, my American Lit students were reading Frederick Douglass, narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass written by himself. I just thought it would be a perfect opportunity for them to see Douglass as more than just ancient words on a page in a textbook, but his actual involvement in the area. However, turned out my students did not want to hang out with their professor on a Saturday afternoon. I forgive you guys. So I called up Mr. John Muller over here, and we kind of batted around some ideas. And first we were thinking about a Zoom lecture during class. That didn't sound all that exciting. And in just a few days, he started doing some extra research and finding some really exciting information, really groundbreaking information that nobody has really written about Frederick Douglass's involvement, not just in Maryland, but in West Virginia. So from there, we decided that it really warranted a bigger event and a wider audience, and here we are. So just a little info about John and Justin. So John Muller is the author of Frederick Douglass in Washington, D.C., The Lion of Anacostia. He has a book he can flash for you later. And he's presented widely throughout the D.C. and Baltimore area at venues including the Library of Congress, the Museum, the Frederick Douglass Historic Site, and local universities. He's also been a frequent guest on Washington, D.C. radio stations and has been cited by the Washington Post, the Washington City Paper, and most recently the Cumberland Times News. And I think one of our reporters is going to be coming to the event in just a little bit. She got lost. He's been featured on C-SPAN's Book TV and C-SPAN's American History TV, and in 2019, he presented on the history of Frederick Douglass throughout Western Maryland, including the Washington County Free Library and Frostburg State University. And I think our crowd is almost rivaling the Frostburg State crowd, so we can be proud of that. John grew up with Mr. Justin McNeil. They've known each other for nearly 20 years, although I've heard rumors that Justin will sometimes only admit to 2 years. McNeil is an IT professional, but obviously a Renaissance man, who has serviced government agencies, nonprofits, corporations, financial and banking institutions, and small businesses in the DC-Baltimore area. He's also a doting husband and a father of 3. He's a historian, an essayist, and a playwright. He's been featured in the pages of the Washington Post, contributed to columns from the Washington Informer, and has been interviewed on a variety of area television stations. And McNeil attended Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia. Muller and McNeil are the co-founders of the Lost History Associates and are at work on forthcoming publications on Frederick Douglass in several specific regions in the Mid-Atlantic region, including now West Virginia. So I want to thank our university relations team for helping get this event set up, including our IT guys who may or may not be in the back still. I want to thank also the Liberal Arts Department and Cassie Pritz for funding this event. And of course, I'd like to thank my students for showing up and thank Justin and John for making the trip down to Potomac State College. So without further ado, the lost history of Frederick Douglass in the Mountain State.
Wonderful to speak to everybody here tonight. Justin will be behind the podium. I will kind of be over here. The presentation will last about an hour. When we get to an hour, maybe raise your hand, shout, or throw something at me, and then we will have time to take your questions and comments and any critiques. The IT department here is filming, so just be aware, I guess, that you're on camera. We ask you to maybe silence your phones or anything that has sound, and if you have a bag of chips, please wait till after the presentation to enjoy. And thank you, special acknowledgement to Professor Caitlin Hudgens for reaching out. Thank you for a lovely introduction, and this presentation is really a genesis of her initiative on reaching out and making this happen in a short period of time. Okay, so we now will take our position So who here knows Randy Moss? Okay. Does anybody know that Steve Harvey is from West Virginia? Okay, I guess, okay, you're very educated audience. Okay, does anyone know that Frederick Douglass made several visits to West Virginia? Okay, wonderful. Well, that's what we will be discussing I'm sorry, let me get the microphone here. Okay. You guys are good? Okay. So the reason why we are gathered here this evening is to properly place Frederick Douglass in the wild and wonderful state of West Virginia. He made more than a half dozen specific high-profile visits throughout the state following the Civil War. Part of the story of the creation of West Virginia, Reconstruction in the United States, West Virginia plays a very integral part in that. This presentation is about 52 slides. It really could have easily been 100. So some of the things I will just tell you, and if you want to follow up on your research and fact check me, you can do so in real time if you have your phones with you. But some may know that at a speech that Frederick Douglass made in New York City in January of 1864 called The Mission of the War, he specifically alludes to the recent creation of West Virginia as essentially an anti-slavery state and says that we can see that the outcome of this war will inevitably be the emancipation or eradication of slavery, because look what happened with the creation of West Virginia. So Douglass was someone whose ear was to the street. He knew people on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. He knew people all over the world, and he really knew what was going on. And when he comes to West Virginia, as I'll share with you tonight, he specifically speaks about how he had heard about what was going on in these communities or knew individuals from these communities, and he was very happy to be making some of these appearances. So just quickly, oh yeah, right. Now, I don't know if Mr. McNeil wants to add anything to that.
No.
Okay. Justin is a Renaissance man, but is actually understated. But he will, we'll kind of make this more of a conversation here this evening. So like I said, we'll keep this to about an hour, and we appreciate everybody being here. Okay, so this is actually a railroad map of West Virginia. We are right about here, I guess. So this is obviously the western panhandle of Maryland, the eastern panhandle of West Virginia. Douglass spoke in the northern panhandle over in this area, and so he really traveled all throughout the state via the railroads. This announcement is from a lecture that he gave in Wheeling, West Virginia in 1867, and some of you who are very knowledgeable about the state's history know the importance of Washington Hall, which we will discuss more specifically. And this is a photograph of Mr. Douglass. From about 1863, he was speaking at Hillsdale College, which is in Michigan, which has a connection to Storer College in Harpers Ferry because they were both essentially founded by Free Will Baptists. Now, just very, very briefly, some may already know this, but I will give a quick orientation. Mr. Frederick Douglass was born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, February of 1818 on Maryland's Eastern Shore. He was affiliated with the Lloyd family. The Lloyd family was one of the leading aristocratic ruling planter classes of Maryland. If anyone has been to Berkeley Springs, there is a historical marker where actually Edward Lloyd IV was actually deeded land in Berkeley Springs, which is that Morgan County? Okay. I don't know that Douglass ever visited Berkeley Springs, but the Lloyd family he was affiliated with Berkeley Springs, as well as George Washington and others. So he goes to Baltimore. He escapes Baltimore in 1838. He is a fugitive slave. He goes to Massachusetts. He gets involved with William Lloyd Garrison, Parker Pillsbury, Lucretia Mott, anti-slavery activists. He becomes a sought-after lecturer and orator. And he was so articulate and well-spoken that people doubted that, in fact, he had been enslaved. And so he wrote an autobiography in 1845 telling of his life story. By show of hands, what students have read that book? Okay, wonderful. And that is really part of the genesis of why we're here tonight, because Professor Hudgens' students have been reading excerpts of his 1845 autobiography. Fast forward, Civil War breaks out. Douglass met with President Abraham Lincoln in the White House on 2 separate occasions. He attended his second inaugural address. Lincoln is assassinated, and then Reconstruction starts, and that's kind of where the history of Douglass in West Virginia begins. All right. So these are the known visits of Frederick Douglass to West Virginia. Following the Civil War, Frederick Douglass made more than a half-dozen visits across West Virginia, from the eastern panhandle to the northern panhandle to the Kanawha River Valley, speaking in the communities of Harpers Ferry in Jefferson County, Martinsburg in Berkeley County, Wheeling in Ohio County, and Parkersburg in Wood County. During these travels throughout the Mountain State, Douglass was hosted by and spoke alongside newspaper publishers and editors, politicians and citizens who founded the wild and wonderful state of West Virginia, and leaders within local black communities, from journalists to college faculty to clergy to doctors. We hope this presentation will document and enliven the history and interconnectedness of Frederick Douglass to West Virginians within reformist circles of education, politics, journalism, the black church, law, and how this local legacy and recognition continues today. So very quickly, Douglass spoke in Wheeling in April of 1867, which the newspaper announcement on the first slide was from. He spoke in Parkersburg in October 1873 with the founding governor of the state. He spoke in Martinsburg in July of 1879, Harpers Ferry in May 1881, again in Wheeling in September of 1884, and Harpers Ferry in May of 1885. Now, just as a note, both of these events in Harpers Ferry were for commencement services at Storer College. In 1881, Douglass was the keynote speaker, where he delivered a very famous lecture on John Brown that he'd been tinkering with for about a decade. And in 1885, he was in attendance at a kind of famous commencement address. Douglass made several public and private visits to Harpers Ferry. He was on the board of trustees at Storer College. So, and I didn't want to get into all of those visits, but he visited the state probably about a dozen times. And as the next slide I allude to, Mr. McNeil and I believe that it's possible there are appearances and speaking engagements that he made that we just have not yet discovered. And as Professor Hudgens alluded to, this research was done in a relatively accelerated time span. And we kind of did this from our laptops and under the confines of pandemic. We can't visit some of these archives. So we hopefully, if somebody maybe knows of other visits that Douglass made, maybe some of you have mementos from visits that Douglass made, please come and approach Mr. McNeil and I after the presentation. We'd be glad to speak with you. On at least one occasion at Wheeling in 1869, Frederick Douglass was announced to speak, but he was unable to make the appearance. Across his public career, there were several speaking engagements that he was unable to make due to illness, death in the family, political emergencies, travel impediments, and other issues. This was not uncommon. It is likely Douglass spoke at other times and locations in West Virginia, whether he was en route westward to Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana, where he spoke frequently, and frequently he would speak in these states during presidential campaigns, or he spoke in West Virginia en route back eastward from travels in either the Northwest, Midwest, or Southern United States. In a half-century of public life, 30 years after the Civil War, Frederick Douglass spoke in hundreds upon hundreds of communities, including freedmen communities in the Mountain South and Appalachian diaspora. And in August of 69, he was supposed to speak in Wheeling. In September 1869, as you'll see from the slide right here, he was invited to speak at an emancipation event in Clarksburg, which is, I don't believe, too far from here. But he was unable to make the appearance. And just as a brief historical note, Lloyd Lowndes, who lived on Washington Street in Cumberland, he was actually born in Clarksburg, West Virginia. And as my friend Sojourner Truth here knows from previous presentations at Frostburg State University, Douglass was a close associate and ally of Lloyd Lowndes, who, although he was the only governor in Maryland's history from Allegheny County, he was actually, in fact, an indigenous West Virginian, and he was from Clarksburg. So the research continues, and this is another photograph of Mr. Douglass. And Douglass, some may know, was the most photographed American of the 19th century. All right. So Douglass also made several visits to Western Maryland, specifically in 1879, which is when he spoke in Martinsburg. Douglass spoke in Frederick City, which is a little ways down, kind of more towards Washington. He spoke in Hagerstown, and in September 22, 1879, he spoke in Cumberland. He also, in March of 1882, spoke in Frostburg, and this was almost 2 decades before the establishment of Normal School Number 2, which became Frostburg State University. So Douglass spoke in neighboring Allegheny County on at least 2 separate occasions that we know. During several visits that Douglass made to Western Maryland, delegations of West Virginia citizens and organizations attended and participated in festivities, including local Mountain State clergy, veterans organizations, cornet brass bands, and fraternal and benevolent associations. The presence of West Virginia citizens and organizations was specifically cited during coverage of the September 1879 visit Douglass made to Cumberland. The presence and arrival of West Virginia citizens in Cumberland was specifically noted, and they arrived via the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. All right. And Justin, feel free to add or edify anything. Justin's, like I said, he's understated, and we are doing these presentations kind of a little bit of freestyle nature. So okay. Some famous West Virginians that Mr. Douglass knew and or worked with are Major Martin Delany. Won't really get into his specific history, but as Mr. McNeil knows, which might get him a little, will incite some reaction from him. Martin Delany is claimed by Pan-Africanists today. Pan-Africanists are essentially a subculture within Black Americans that feel that Black Americans should return to Africa, live in Africa, and Martin Delany was a very early proponent of that.
Africa for Africa, right? That's what he said.
And this was essentially the colonization movement, which was started in about the 1820s, was for essentially white citizens, but there were Black citizens, including, for example, like Martin Delany, that advocated that Black Americans should go to Africa and they would live a more freer lifestyle there. And this is where you get the creation of Liberia, which is essentially like an American colony.
Which proved that wrong, by the way, as well. If you know the history of Liberia.
And in Liberia recently with Charles Taylor has had a lot of civil war and strife. And Mr. McNeil and I went to school with folks actually who had fled Liberia. But anyway, so Douglass took a adversarial position where he thought that colonization schemes and ideas were not going to help Black Americans and that America should essentially reconcile with its history, and Douglass thought that colonization was not the answer. Abraham Lincoln very early on in his presidency adopted a colonization plan to actually have free Black Americans as well as emancipated Black Americans go to live in South America. So anyway, so Douglass and Martin Delany had essentially a philosophical disagreement where Douglass was very patriotic in his belief that Black Americans had as much claim to American identity.
Yeah, and I would also say that Douglass would have probably taken the position that had you not been able to prove that we could live, in reconciled peace, then, the ideals that America purports would be false, right? It's like if we have to leave to South America in order for us to find peace, then the Bill of Rights and all the Constitution was a lie. That's how I take it.
So I told you that would get a reaction from Mr. McNeil.
Okay.
And this is an ongoing conversation that is occurring today. And if anybody is on Twitter and knows the hashtags, it's a very active conversation. So with that said, Martin Delany, like I said, was a very prominent leader in his time, but philosophically, him and Douglass had disagreements. Martin Delany was born in Charlestown, Jefferson County. He was born about 1812. His family essentially moved to Pennsylvania. Delany started a newspaper in Pittsburgh. He was essentially a Western correspondent for Douglass's newspaper called the North Star, which he started in the late 1840s and ran up until the Civil War. And there's a historical marker for Major Martin Delany right outside the courthouse in Charlestown where John Brown was hanged. This gentleman, Archibald W. Campbell, was from Wheeling. He's a very fascinating, interesting guy who was friends with Mr. Douglass for many decades, and specifically at the 1880 Republican National Convention alluded to how when Douglass spoke in Wheeling, he had a hard time finding a hotel that would accommodate him, and Mr. Campbell took it upon himself to make sure that Mr. Douglass was treated with the hospitality that he expected of Wheeling to offer any visiting dignitary. Mr. J.R. Clifford, he's a very fascinating fellow who was a close friend of Judge Joseph Thatcher Hoke, who was not from Mineral County, but Judge Hoke spent many years in Mineral County and actually was a judge who represented Mineral County. And Mr. Clifford was a lawyer who in the 1890s filed two very interesting civil rights cases, and he was successful. And one of the reasons was because when he brought the cases in the local court, he had an ace up his sleeve because Judge Hoke was the Chief Justice of this local court, and essentially Judge Hoke, because he had known Mr. Clifford when he was a student at Storer College, ruled in his favor. And I mean, I could.
One of those cases is they were trying to cut back the hours or the days, the time for the black schools from 8 months to 5, and subsequently not pay the teachers. So J.R. Clifford, filed suit, won, and actually won the teacher her wages as well.
And so these are pioneering civil rights cases for essentially like equal access to education, more than 60 years basically before Brown versus Board of Education. And in the past decade or so, there's been a lot of work done on Mr. Clifford. He's a fascinating fellow. I'll talk a little bit more about him later in the presentation.
Also a Storer College alum.
Definitely Storer College alum. Mm-hmm. His great niece is here. Well, that is wonderful. We want to especially acknowledge the Honorable J.R. Clifford and all of his family that carry on his legacy today. So that's one.
Where's your hand?
If you want to remain anonymous, you can do so too.
And J.R. Clifford is related to Skip Gates, correct? Henry Louis Gates?
My understanding, I'm sure the family member can correct us, but I believe that.
Great nephew, yeah. Henry Louis Gates, that's right.
And the Jane Gates house on Green Street in Cumberland, the family members I'm sure could confirm more than I could as a historian, but J.R. Clifford was the first black lawyer to practice in Allegheny County, and it is quite possible, I believe, that maybe in a break from court he would have gone down to Jane Gates' house, which I believe Jane Gates was his aunt, or he was Jane Gates. Does anyone know the Jane Gates house in Cumberland? Okay, wonderful. Okay, so moving forward, and like I said, we'll talk more about Clifford later, and we're glad to talk about him in the post-presentation discussion. All right, this gentleman I alluded to, Judge Joseph Thatcher Hoke. Okay, he spent about 20 or 30 years in New Creek / Kaiser, Mineral County. Mr. Clifford and Judge Hoke were friends and associates for 30, 40 years. Mr. Hoke is a very interesting gentleman because he attended Oberlin College. Oberlin College in the 1850s was one of the few American universities that was co-ed and integrated. John Mercer Langston, for example, attended Oberlin College. So essentially, Judge Hoke went to his undergraduate years in a very, progressive educational environment that was a rarity for its day. He later attained a law degree from the University of Michigan. And I don't know if he has a house that still exists locally, but he is a very fascinating gentleman. And in the middle is West Virginia's founding governor, Arthur Boreman, United States Senator Arthur Boreman, and Mr. Frederick Douglass and Mr. Boreman shared a stage in 1873, which I'll talk about in a moment. And Booker T. Washington was born in Virginia, but essentially was raised in West Virginia, right outside of Charleston. And this is another thing, not to deviate too much, but Booker T. Washington is known as an advocate for mechanical arts instruction, industrial education, kind of what today would be the term vocational instruction, and it's frequently taught where basically he was there was Booker T. Washington on one side of the street and W.E.B. Du Bois on the other side of the street with the talented 10th, and frequently put in very simplistic terms the way it's taught. And Mr. Frederick Douglass was an advocate for the humanities and a supporter of the black arts movement, and kind of was in a certain way within the social circles of the talented 10th, let's say, but also Mr. Douglass was, on the flip side of the coin, a proponent for manual, industrial, vocational instruction. And Douglass spoke at Tuskegee University in March of 1892. And I do not have slides specifically about this, but in October of 1894, there was a ribbon cutting for the Manassas Industrial School, and two of the keynote speakers there were Principal J.R. Clifford and one of the institution's benefactor, Mr. Frederick Douglass. So Douglass not only, in terms of philosophically supported industrial education, but actually put his time and treasury and advocacy to helping essentially create, like, I don't know if Lincoln Tech still like exists today, but essentially kind of like Lincoln Tech sort of university. I don't know, you want to maybe say something on that, Justin?
On what, the Lincoln Tech part? I'm sorry.
No, not Lincoln Tech.
Well, I guess a little bit, I grew up with learning about Booker T. Washington, and it wasn't until I got much older that I kind of found myself at odds with a lot of what he said. Now, I do agree with his stance on technical and vocational training, but I don't know if anybody's familiar with like the Atlanta Compromise, where he kind of essentially said, Negroes should get to work, find employment, and then, kind of stay out of politics and let that kind of be the white man's world. I don't agree with that. It's a half measure of justice is no justice at all, right? So, and at the same time, I also disagree with W.E. Du Bois and the talented 10th and the kind of boule societies of Negroes during that time. But like I said, you eat the meat, you spit out the bones, So.
All right. And it's got a little bit of a deviation from Frederick Douglass' specific history, but I thought this would be enlightening nonetheless. For those of you who have read Booker T. Washington's 1901 autobiography, and there was a couple different versions of it, he talks about his adolescence and childhood in West Virginia. He talks about working in the coal mines, and Booker T. Washington came to Washington, D.C. to attend Wayland Seminary in D.C., which, if anyone's familiar with, was on the former campus of Malcolm X Park, Meridian Hill Park, right on 16th Street. So Booker T. Washington comes to Wayland Seminary in the 1880s. He would return to his home in West Virginia kind of during the summer. And this is an interesting little excerpt. Justin, you want to read it? You want me?
So during the year that I spent in Washington and for some little time before this, there had been considerable agitation in the state of West Virginia over the question of moving the capital of the state from Wheeling to some other central point. As a result of this, the legislature designated 3 cities to be voted upon by the citizens of the state as the permanent seat of government. Among these cities was Charleston, only 5 miles from Malden, my home. At the close of my school year in Washington, I was very pleasantly surprised to receive from a committee of white people in Charleston. See, it's like sometimes it's a little too accommodationist for me. That's all. An invitation to canvass the state in the interest of that city. This invitation I accepted and spent nearly 3 months in speaking in various parts of the state. Charleston was successful in winning the prize and is now the permanent seat of government. That's a nice little excerpt. I'm not sure,
That I do not know. I will allow, or I mean not allow, but I will defer to local historians. I do not know what the other places were for consideration. If someone said Parkersburg, that might have been one. I'm not sure. Because Parkersburg was home. Okay, because I think Parkersburg was the home of like 4 of the first 6 governors of the state. Okay, wonderful. All right, so we are moving a little slowly, but I think everyone is enjoying the presentation. But does anyone know where this print or what this is depicting? Call it out. Wonderful. Okay, so this is a print from John Brown's failed raid on Harper's Ferry. This is actually the B&O Railroad Station, kind of an Italianate ornamentation. This is like where the point is overlooking the Shenandoah River right here, Potomac River up here, Kaiser's like over here, then down there is Washington, and the Arsenal today, where the Arsenal is not the current location, there's an obelisk, so the orientation is a little different, but this is Brown and his fellows and the United States Marines, Robert E. Lee, etc. So, one of the most famous connections that Frederick Douglass has with West Virginia is one, in fact, that he does not actually have. In the lead up to John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in October of 1859, Douglass met with Captain John Brown in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. Douglass had known of John Brown's plan for more than a decade. He'd actually met with Brown in Detroit earlier in 1859, and Douglass respectfully declined John Brown's invitation to participate in the raid, feeling that it was in fact a fatal mission. There was a gentleman, Shields Green, who was with Douglass, and basically tells Douglass famously, like, I'm going to go with the old man, etc. And when John Brown's raid was unsuccessful, not to get all the specifics and particulars of that, it's actually very interesting. I've not horribly read up on that history, but Brown had 21 men, 18 went to seize Harper's Ferry. They controlled the town for a little over a day, and there's a big interesting plan where basically, like I said, Douglass knew about the plan and speaks about the plan, and I'll get a little bit into that later when Douglass speaks about John Brown. But in the aftermath, it was very dangerous because Frederick Douglass was implicated, and United States Marshals descended upon his home in Rochester. Douglass, because he had his ear to the street, knew a lot of people. He actually got advance notice that the marshals were coming from in Rochester because Douglass knew the telegraph officer in Rochester. And so he fled to Canada and then spent about 6 months in Europe and then waited for essentially his name to be cleared. And when he was exonerated, Douglass returns back to the United States, and this is in 1860. All right. And that is a young Mr. Brown, kind of Mr. Douglass with this kind of trademark. I don't know if anyone remembers the Afro Sheen commercials from like the 70s.
They had the one with Douglass.
Douglass. Actually, you can go on YouTube and find it. Essentially, Douglass's visage of kind of his kind of leonine mane was kind of part of, like, I mean, you can, today, if you have little kids, you can buy the Frederick Douglass, like, Halloween costumes. Okay, so, and if anyone's seen The Good Lord Bird,
Bless you.
yes, because that Good Lord Bird is a really, really troubling depiction of Frederick Douglass and John Brown, and I won't waste any more time on that, but it's just very troubling. Please, if you've seen that, take time to read like the real history and research. All right. So, following the Civil War, you had the work of the Freedmen's Bureau. Okay, the Freedmen's Bureau was led by General Oliver Otis Howard, who the namesake of Howard University in Washington, D.C. is from. And the Freedmen's Bureau was an extension of the United States Army or the Union Army, and they were dispatched to the South to help to essentially negotiate labor contracts, help to prevent it. There was a couple of different things that the Freedmen's Bureau did, but one thing is that they kind of were like peace officers or magistrate officers to help essentially maintain peace in the former Confederate states. And what's interesting is Maryland, Delaware, and West Virginia were obviously not formally part of the Confederate States of America, but there were Freedmen's Bureau schools in Delaware, Maryland, and West Virginia, and the supervision or administration of Freedmen's Bureau schools in D.C., Delaware, Maryland, West Virginia all fell under kind of the same auspices, and a lot of this was coordinated out of D.C., and this is an interesting just little pic where essentially you have like General Howard standing in the middle. You have kind of the, aggrieved, I guess, former Confederate officers, and then you have the kind of new, freedmen communities, and then you have the American flag. And so this is kind of an interesting historical print. All right. So one of the, most important lasting historical legacies of the Freedmen's Bureau is the establishment of freedmen's schools. So south of the Mason-Dixon line, essentially was against the law, or in very, very few instances, there were limited opportunities for black communities, black children to attend schools. And the schools south of the Mason-Dixon line, if there was publicly funded education, it was essentially for white students. And so the Freedmen's Bureau, with the authority of the United States Army, and kind of working within philanthropic organizations and associations from Baltimore, New England, New York, helped to start Freedmen's Bureau schools. And there were several Freedmen's Bureau schools in West Virginia. I do not know what the nearest Freedmen's Bureau school was from where we stand. Someone may be able to tell me that. When I say Freedmen's Bureau school, I mean in West Virginia, because there were Freedmen's Bureau schools in Allegheny County in Cumberland, so it is quite possible that people cross state lines to go to West Virginians could have attended school in Cumberland. I don't actually have any specific information on that, but if they're family genealogists, you see things like that all the time. So anyway, so this is just a print of a Freedmen's Bureau school. Here are kind of the students. Here's essentially probably like a white teacher, probably usually sent from like New England or New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut. And here's maybe, for example, father of one of the students, or someone who essentially would have, a lot of times the Freedmen's Bureau schools were established on land donated by black church or black landowner. All right, okay, so this is where the interesting history starts. Because I've patiently waited. I mean, this has been interesting, right? It gets more interesting. Right, Justin?
Very.
Okay. So this is this is a document from, I believe it's like October 1869. For those of you who are kind of hardcore genealogists or family historians, Ancestry.com, Family Search is free. It's easy to set up an account, and Freedmen's Bureau records and materials are on Family Search. A lot of these materials in the past 5 to 10 years have been digitized. Still a little difficult, essentially, to find things. If you have a name, you can find a name or a town, you can kind of find some information. But this is listing the roster of Freedmen's Bureau schools at that time that were in West Virginia. Now, there were additional schools that had existed before, after. Freedmen's Bureau operated from about 1865 to 1871, 1872, and then it was essentially dissolved. There are schools in Harper's Ferry. Now, this school, Nathan C. Brackett, who was essentially the founding principal and or president of Storer College, you'll see that the school is under the patronage of the school trustees and essentially owned by the government, which I'll get into in just a little bit a moment when we talk a little bit more about Storer College. And then here's kind of like the more community college, high school, and this is the public school that was run by essentially his wife. And here is a school in Point Pleasant, Martinsburg, Parkersburg, and Charlestown. This report from the Freedmen's Bureau shows schools throughout West Virginia. And this is just an interesting document. This gentleman, Mr. Campbell, was a superintendent. He was based out of Washington, and as Mr. McNeil knows, is the namesake for the elementary school on Minnesota Avenue. All right. So essentially, the Freedmen's Bureau School was the genesis for Storer College. Frederick Douglass was instrumental in gathering early support for the creation of Storer College in Harpers Ferry, West Virginia, which is Jefferson County. In 1867, Douglass, along with more than 24 reformers, philanthropists, educators, and politicians petitioned for a charter for the Commission for the Promotion of Education in the South. In 1881, Douglass delivered a highly publicized lecture on John Brown on the campus of Storer, which we'll get to in a second. As Douglass served on the Board of Trustees of Howard University in D.C. from 1871 until his death in 1895, Douglass served on the Board of Trustees of Storer College during the late 1880s and 1890s. Douglass was a friend to faculty and students and aided in raising funds for the college and lobbying the federal government on behalf of Storer College. This is a print from this is a newspaper clip from early 1867 where it's talking about college for freedmen at Harper's Ferry. And essentially this is like a petition to the federal government, and there are several noteworthy citizens here, including, like, for example, United States Senator, and there is Mr. Frederick Douglass. So very, very early on, he was an advocate for Storer College, which if Storer College existed today, it closed in 1955. It may have been folded into the West Virginia University system. I guess that's speculation, but it was a very prominent university or college. All right. So, West Virginia, this is another Freedmen's Bureau document. I don't know, just you want to read this? You want me to do it?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So this is a transcription of this. It says, West Virginia, this is written from the Superintendent of Education. We have aided in erecting several schoolhouses in the state, and schools are carried on in them, but I find it extremely difficult to get regular reports from them. The colored people are clustered in places far apart. It requires a long journey, therefore, to visit all the schools. Just to make a contemporaneous example, the Wi-Fi is a little spotty, and we need rural broadband, so maybe that is kind of historically what he was alluding to. Like the telegraph system may not have been as well established in West Virginia at that point. Okay, I make occasional visits and correspond frequently, but reports come in slowly. By law of Congress, a very valuable property at Harper's Ferry has been donated to Storer College. They're located, which is thus put on a good footing and bids fair to become a thriving institution. Great credit is due to Reverend Nathan C. Brackett, now in charge of the college, for his efforts to secure this donation and carry this institution through its infancy. All right, very, very quickly, some members of Storer College Board of Trustees. And Storer College was a co-ed integrated institution from its inception. Francis Stewart Mosher was a professor at Hillsdale College, and essentially the Free Will Baptists were responsible for, or instrumental in securing financial support for Storer College, and Miss Mosher was on their board. To the left is John Wesley Cromwell. He was on the Board of Trustees of Storer College. He worked very closely with Carter G. Woodson, West Virginian Carter G. Woodson in Washington, D.C., on like Negro history publications. I forget the exact kind of name of the organization, but today it is like ASALA, which is essentially...
I can't remember the exact...
Essentially, John W. Cromwell wrote a lot of... historical essays and historical pieces that were published by Carter G. Woodson in his kind of Black history publishing networks. And Douglass was a close ally of Mr. Cromwell. Mr. Cromwell was close friends with Mr. J.R. Clifford. John W. Cromwell's family was very influential. His daughter was the first Black American graduate of Dartmouth, for example. And Mr. Clifford wrote... Western Virginia dispatches for Mr. Cromwell's D.C. newspaper, The People's Advocate. To the right is Mr. William Still. I don't know if anyone has seen the movie Harriet, which is another fanciful movie. Won't even get into my disagreements with Clifford. The movie Harriet is very fanciful, and it's unfortunate it's presented that way because there's really no reason to exaggerate on the true history.
I will say this, that in my research, I found no findings of any Black bounty hunters roaming the countryside with a pistol on their hip looking for ex-slaves, or looking for current slaves, and I've never seen that.
For those of you familiar with the movie Harriet, that was essentially like the plot line of the movie was made up, but essentially William Still, who...
That was the guy's name.
So William Still was depicted in the movie Harriet. William Still was played by Leslie Odom, who was in the musical Hamilton, etc. And so William Still was probably one of the most famous Black conductors on the Underground Railroad. He kept essentially a journal or a diary of folks coming to his office in Philadelphia, and he had networks throughout the country and in Canada, and published in 1872 a kind of a history of the Underground Railroad. He was on the board of Storer College along with Mr. Douglass. And actually, Douglass and William Still are kind of another sort of thing where they kind of had a little bit of an acrimonious relationship. All right, so Storer College, just in the interest of time, I'll move this forward just a little bit. But this is Anthony Hall right here. This still stands on the campus. Today, the campus has been essentially preserved because the National Park Service has administrative buildings in the old dormitories and old classrooms of Harper's Ferry. This is just kind of another print that goes a little bit into the history. All right. It's a catalog. For those of you who do extensive kind of online research, you can find some of the catalogs from Storer College from like the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s online, and there are students represented from all throughout West Virginia, including Mineral County.
As I understand it, also didn't Judge Hoke, he secured the charter for Storer College 1866-67?
Yes, Judge Hoke served on the board of Storer College from its creation in 1867 until his death. So Judge Hoke, who was closely affiliated with where we are standing now, Mineral County, was an advocate for Storer College, and I'll share a little bit about that in just a moment. This is a front piece from Douglass's speech in 1881 on John Brown, and this was essentially published and printed and sold and distributed throughout the country, like at bookstores. All right, this is just a kind of a historical yearbook photo of Storer College. And I guess it's kind of mostly lady students. This is, I think, about 1881, 82. And the West Virginia University Center for Regional History is a great, great resource for historical photos and other historical resources based out of Morgantown.
Now, do you think it's mostly ladies because Storer College was founded first as a normal school?
Excellent point.
Right?
So, yeah, Storer College was formed as a normal school, which kind of in maybe today's language would be known as like a teacher's college, where Storer College would educate and prepare teachers to then go teach in the newly formed, essentially publicly funded schoolhouses throughout kind of the American South. And it kind of varied from state to state, but usually graduates of Storer College would then go kind of like into the Shenandoah Valley, come out to West Virginia and teach at some of these schools, or even in some cases become like private tutors. And so they had kind of the qualifications and kind of pre-classroom instruction internships. And so that's a good point where some of the earlier classes are more there's a higher percentage of female graduates than male graduates. All right. Okay, so when Frederick Douglass ran a newspaper in Washington, D.C., and if you're a student, please remember to sign in to get your extra credit. Don't leave without signing in to get your extra credit. Get the highest GPA that you can get, because that's probably what Mr. Douglass would have told you. All right. So Frederick Douglass ran a newspaper in D.C. from 1870 to 1874. You can find this on the Library of Congress Chronicling America website. And so Mr. Douglass devoted space in his newspapers to advocate for the university, for the college. And this is essentially kind of an advertisement for Storer College. This is, I believe they're trying to raise here $50,000 for a new girls' dormitory. And it mentions that if you're seeking information about how to support Storer College, you could seek out Judge Hoke in New Creek, West Virginia, Mineral County. And then here's Henry Wilson, who's vice president under Grant. He was a senator from Massachusetts. And James Garfield, who at that time was a congressman from Ohio and later went on to be an American president. And I will have to say that, unfortunately, some of the history of Storer College is not presented very well currently at Harper's Ferry National Historic Park, which Mr. McNeil and I are trying to work with some organizations to do that, but it's not easy. And for those of you who are students who are going to pursue history, public history, and how we try to advocate and work to present the history, it is very difficult. It requires a great commitment, and it is a task worth pursuing, so yes. Okay. Here is Mr. Douglass. Here's another photo. This is the prosecuting attorney for John Brown. It's kind of a little depiction of the courthouse. And when Frederick Douglass, I'll just read this here. And when Douglass gave his commencement address in May of 1881, people were expecting potential fireworks, okay? Because there was a rumor on the street that the prosecuting attorney for John Brown would attend. And what's really interesting is Frederick Douglass was pursued at various times of his life by United States Marshals. United States Marshals were responsible for enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, and Frederick Douglass actually became a United States Marshal. It's kind of an interesting, just kind of extreme of American history. So anyway, so it says, Mr. Hunter, who was the state's attorney against Brown, sat just in the rear of Douglass and gave him the hand of congratulations when he had concluded. So essentially, they basically kind of shook hands, and Mr. Hunter complimented Douglass on his address. And this little anecdote, explained kind of in some direct quotes, was printed in newspapers throughout the country. And this is kind of like the whole reconciliation of the country that would go on to in terms of Reconstruction, where you would have Douglass was someone who would work with former Confederate generals and politicians if they were essentially advocating or working to support black communities. And there were many like reformist, I guess, Confederates that Douglass worked alongside, and that could be a whole nother conversation or presentation. It's kind of just an interesting little note. All right. Okay, so I mentioned Mr. Randy Moss. Okay, he was a famous West Virginian. He was a Monday Night Football, and he attended, as I understand, Marshall University. And I know our friend here, Hunter, knows he has many famous.
Straight cash, homie.
That was a saying that when Randy Moss was fined by the NFL, because Randy Moss kind of had some trials and tribulations early on in his career. For those of you who may know, Randy Moss' experience in West Virginia. Then when he became a Minnesota Viking, he was fined for something. I think he mooned the fans or something. And so or choreographed it. And he was fined by the NFL, and a reporter said to him, "How are you going to pay Mr. Moss?" And he said, what did he say, Hunter? All right, okay. So with that said, if Randy Moss, let's say, had existed in the late 1800s, it's quite possible that he would have played for Storr College. Frederick Douglass was someone who was a fan of baseball, boxing, the pony races, and in fact, the very, very early iterations of football. Now, this is the M Street School in Washington, D.C. today is like Dunbar High School. Mr. McNeil and I both know the father of Mr. Honorable Vernon Davis, who played for San Francisco Giants, Washington football team, etc. He went to Dunbar. And Frederick Douglass's grandson, Haley George Douglass, was in the Harvard class of 1905. He played football. He coached Dunbar, and he specifically made it a point to bring his high school students from Washington, D.C. on the B&O Railroad to Harper's Ferry, up the hill, and to play Storr College. So essentially you had a college team playing a high school team. Here is a print. This is from the, I think, 1907, 1908. It's the Storr College football team. Here is kind of the box score. And so this is kind of an early iteration of NCAA intercollegiate athletics. And back then, the coaches, which is interesting, Coach Douglass would serve as one of the umpire. This is before you had, challenges and instant replay and everything else. So it's interesting where they obviously thought that the opposing coach would be partial. And this is Coach Douglass right here. So it's kind of just an interesting little footnote. And the score was 11-0, so low-scoring affair. All right, so Mr. Clifford. God, what slide are we on? Because we're definitely behind time. It's all right.
On 22.
Okay, yeah, we got like 30 more. 30 more to go. Okay. So J.R. Clifford is buried in Arlington National Cemetery. He was a veteran of the Union Army. He has several historic markers throughout the state of West Virginia. I believe this is probably from Martinsburg. He was featured on a United States postage stamp in 2009. This is a very famous photo. Here is W.E.B. Du Bois standing as Mr. Clifford. The Niagara Movement, which was essentially the early iteration of the NAACP, they had their second meeting in Harper's Ferry And that was largely due to Mr. Clifford and his organizing skills, or kind of contacts and relationships within the area. And Mr. Clifford's daughter actually kind of read the opening poem of the ceremony. And this is from an 1887 biography. Justin, you want to read it?
I'll just read an excerpt from there. When only 16 years of age, he enlisted in the United States Heavy Artillery, Company F, and served as a corporal, but finally appointed nurse in a hospital, serving there until the war ended. When he was mustered out at Louisville, Kentucky in 1870, he went to Wheeling, West Virginia, and conducted a large writing school with nearly 100 attendants. In the years 1871, 72, 73, he taught a similar school at Martins Ferry, Ohio. Not yet satisfied with his attainments, he attended Storer College at Harper's Ferry, graduating in 1878.
And in the early 1880s, Mr. Clifford started the Pioneer Press. He would frequently attend the annual meetings of the Colored Press Association, and Frederick Douglass would frequently attend these meetings and address the kind of week-long conference. And Mr. Douglass and Mr. Clifford worked together and kind of knew each other across about 20 years. All right. Now, fast forward, this is a newspaper dispatch that Mr. Clifford wrote in 1876. Mr. Clifford writes, "It is well known and to credit of both white and colored that in 1868 the legislature of this state gave a charter to Storer College, situated at Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. Among her advocates, Judge J.T. Hoke of Kaiser, West Virginia, deserves special thanks." This is, I believe, 1860 photograph from Judge Hoke when he graduated from the University of Michigan Law School. And so Mr. Clifford is essentially writing, I believe it's from Martinsburg Independent. He's writing about this meeting that they had, and he makes an interesting little allusion here. He says that he was very impressed with the comportment of the attendees. He said, "Young men did not care to have strangers know they had new shoes, and the young ladies forgot all about their quarterly meeting bonnets." This is just photos of the Storer College band. Mr. Clifford wrote, kind of closing, a little short poem. "Storer, we look to these as our first guide, with no little degree of heartfelt pride, accept prayers of your sons and daughters true, which are the noblest homage that we can pay to you." All right, so in 1879, Mr. Douglass visits Martinsburg. The historic B&O Railroad depot remains in Martinsburg. This station house pictured has been preserved. MARC trains run today daily down to Washington from Martinsburg on to Baltimore. It was via this historic railway that in 1879 Frederick Douglass visited Martinsburg. Mr. Clifford passed through this station countless times over his half-century of public service to West Virginia, the region, and throughout the country, taking the train to Richmond, Chicago, New York City, and elsewhere. Has anyone taken a train from this train station? Wonderful. Excellent. Okay, cool. That's cool. So, and you can see this is before they had Model A's and Model T's. And you still had horses right there. Okay, cool. And this, of course, some know is the location of a very famous railroad strike in 1877. All right. This is kind of a historic print of Martinsburg. It's from around the Civil War. All right, just a couple little notes. So Mr. Frederick Douglass was a frequent traveler on the B&O Railroad. The B&O Railroad's president was John Garrett, who Garrett County in nearby Maryland is named after. And the B&O Railroad had essentially a non-discriminatory practice of if you were a black American citizen and bought a first-class ticket, you would be able to sit in the first-class section, which not all railroads across the country had those policies. So this is just an interesting note of Martinsburg. Or basically, Douglass is taking the train, and someone runs up to him and talks to him and essentially says Douglass is very easygoing and friendly. This is a newspaper clip specifically from Douglass's appearance in Martinsburg. It says, "The colored people of Martinsburg had a picnic at the fairgrounds on Thursday. Quite a number of visitors from Maryland and Pennsylvania participated. Marshal Frederick Douglass of D.C. delivered the address. He was met at the depot by a committee of white folks composed of Mayor Logan, John Wisner, who was a councilman, and some former military folks. And the committee seated him in a carriage and attended him to the Continental Hotel. Marshall Douglass spoke hopefully of his race and gave them good advice. Everything passed off very quietly. And Mr. Clifford filed a dispatch to the People's Advocate in Washington, D.C. that was published by John Wesley Cromwell covering Mr. Douglass' visit to town. All right, and just in the interest of time, I won't read all of this. Just to take a quick note that Douglass stayed at the Continental Hotel, which is interesting, whereas Martinsburg obviously did not discriminate against Mr. Douglass staying in probably what was, the most fashionable elite hotel of that time. And this is the Continental Hotel. This is from, I believe, the early 1900s. And sorry that's not a better view. And I do not know if the Continental Hotel still is in Martinsburg. I couldn't really determine that. But yeah, all right. So I know at least one person knows the answer to this question. What well-known NBA All-Star is from the same town in which Frederick Douglass and Arthur Boreman spoke together in 1873? If you know who this guy is, just call it out. Is Hunter still here? Does anybody know who this is? Hint, he will be fighting ex-NFL star Frank Gore on an undercard December 18. Deron Williams, we have a winner. Okay, excellent. So Deron Williams, who was an NBA All-Star for the Utah Jazz, Brooklyn Nets, I believe he played with LeBron James, he played with the Cleveland Cavaliers. He is from Parkersburg, where in 1873, Frederick Douglass spoke alongside sitting United States Senator Arthur Boreman, who had served as West Virginia's first governor. At the time, Douglass was serving as editor of the New National Era, a weekly newspaper in D.C. After his United States Senate term, Boreman remained active in state Republican Party politics and legal affairs, serving as a circuit judge in Wood County. Boreman worked alongside attorney and newspaper editor J.R. Clifford, a close friend and associate of Mr. Douglass, in advocating for the rights of black West Virginians. Here is a photo of Mr. Boreman. This was in Matthew Brady's photography studio, presently at 7th and Pennsylvania Avenue in downtown D.C. And just real quickly, Frederick Douglass at Parkersburg. We should think that the man who ran away from Maryland as a fugitive slave in the early part of his life would feel a good deal like the aged Simeon these later days and be almost reconciled to depart this life now that his eyes have seen so great a measure of temporal salvation vouchsafed to himself and his whole race in this country. And this leads us to remark upon the spectacle of Fred Douglass, whom we hardly ventured to introduce to a willing audience a few years ago, being introduced this time at Parkersburg by United States Senator of the state, the Honorable Arthur I. Boreman. Surely the heart of Frederick must have swelled somewhat within him to think that he had lived to see such a day. Now, because Mr. Douglass closely followed the creation and establishment of West Virginia, I'm sure that he knew about Mr. Boreman, and probably they had some shared associates. I've not yet kind of determined how this event came together. The papers of Mr. Boreman are at Morgantown, but it is possible that Mr. Boreman invited Douglass, or when Douglass was there, he invited Boreman, and they most likely spoke to benefit a local organization in Parkersburg. All right. This is kind of an interesting little historical note on Mr. Boreman. West Virginia Governor Arthur Boreman is here sending President Lincoln a dispatch from Wheeling, West Virginia in November 1864. So today, there's a lot of news and commentary about voting rights and voting returns, etc. And so this was long before the days of cable news networks and all sorts of things where people wanted to know timely election results. And so Mr. Boreman is writing Mr. Lincoln, I will furnish the vote as soon as possible under the law of the state that county officers cannot certify the vote to me until the 12th day after the election. So Mr. Lincoln wanted to know as soon as possible that he was going to be reelected. And West Virginia was essentially created just like Nevada. It went pro-Lincoln. And West Virginia, as a percentage of popular vote, gave Mr. Lincoln the 5th highest percentage. All right. And there's Mr. Boreman's signature. Mr. Boreman's signature right there. All right. Frederick Douglass and West Virginia were interconnected in a variety of cross-associations through leaders within reformist movements and circles of politics, education of black church journalism, temperance, suffrage, and philanthropy, among other causes. For example, in July 1886, the West Virginia Republican Party organized a big conference in Parkersburg. Reporting on the meeting were the editors of the Martinsburg Independent, including John Nelson Wisner, sorry for that typo, and he was the gentleman who was on the hospitality committee when Douglass visited Martinsburg. And when he traveled to this event, he traveled with Mr. Clifford, who he noted here last Wednesday in company with Mr. Clifford. We attended the conference. At the meeting was ex-Senator Mr. Boreman, who had introduced Douglass in Parkersburg in 1873. The presence of Mr. Clifford warranted a small but separate paragraph of note. Mr. Clifford was warmly greeted by a host of personal and political friends. He made some pertinent remarks. So in discussing some of this history with Professor Hudgens, it's quite possible that in 1886, the three of them got together and said, hey, have you heard from Fred lately? Or did you read about Mr. Douglass in the paper? Or, do you hear that he's going to travel to Europe or whatever it may be? All right. This is a kind of overview, or kind of a map made from before you had drones, you had hot air balloons. This is from the early 1900s of Parkersburg. Here is a historic marker for Mr. Boreman in Parkersburg. It's the inauguration of the new state, and Mr. Boreman issues this. And for those students who are going to matriculate to West Virginia's campus, West Virginia University's campus in Morgantown, Krukow's son knew Boreman Hall. You might stay potentially in Boreman Hall. And you can say you know history about Mr. Boreman. Okay. All right, Frederick Douglass spoke in Wheeling, West Virginia on at least two separate occasions, in April 1867 following the war and in September 1884. His several appearances in Wheeling were for a variety of occasions, including the laying of a cornerstone, or this was he was unable to make the event, which was the laying of a cornerstone for a local African Methodist Episcopal church. He was invited by a local literary society in 1867, and in 1884 attended an Emancipation Day event. And what's interesting is Douglass, in 1884, spoke in the Opera House. This building is still standing in Wheeling, and this was the site of Washington Hall, which is essentially where, I guess, kind of administratively, legislatively, West Virginia as a state was created. All right, this is the old Washington Hall. It's like a Masonic lodge. It's probably hard to read this, but this marker is right outside the building today, which denotes essentially its historicity to West Virginia. May 1861, the convention in Washington Hall selected as the place where essentially the work to create West Virginia out of Virginia was commenced. All right. And in 1867, Douglass spoke in Washington Hall. So Douglass spoke in the same building or the same grounds where essentially West Virginia was created. This is another print of Washington Hall. Here is the newspaper print from 1867 announcing his great lecture. This is Mr. Campbell. Mr. Campbell purchased the Wheeling Daily Intelligencer in 1856. He became its editor and used the paper to express his abolitionist view. A staunch Unionist and early member of the Republican Party, he supported Abraham Lincoln for president. By 1861, Campbell was one of the most influential leaders in the West Virginia statehood movement. He served as Wheeling postmaster during the Civil War. He was known as a militant, so naturally, therefore, he associated with Mr. Douglass. You'll see in this print here, when Douglass speaks in Wheeling in 1867, he is introduced by Mr. Campbell of the Intelligencer. And this is Mr. Campbell here. All right. This was the event that Douglass was unable to attend, but I think he gave the confirmation that he would attend. It's just probably some travel irregularities, wasn't able to make it. And it was announced that a grand demonstration was going to happen for the laying of a cornerstone. And Mr. Delaney was able to attend, as well as John Mercer Langston, but Douglass was unable to attend. And just in the interest of time, I won't get too much into Bishop Alexander Walker Wayman was essentially a next-door neighbor in childhood of Frederick Douglass. Bishop Wayman was babysat by Frederick Douglass's wife, and Bishop Wayman traveled throughout the country establishing the AME Church, and he traveled, for example, to West Virginia on several occasions. This is from the early 1920s. This is Wayman AME Church in Wheeling. In December 1879, Bishop Wayman traveled to Wheeling to dedicate a new AME Church, first taking the name of Wayman Chapel, then Wayman AME Church, and that still worships today in present-day Wheeling. And Wayman's 1882 autobiography mentions visiting Wheeling on several occasions, as well as Parkersburg, in service of the growth of the AME Church in the Mountain State. This is, for example, one little excerpt. It says, I left Baltimore for the purpose, passed through Frederick and Cumberland Sunday, January 1st, 1871, dedicated a new church at Frostburg, Maryland, which today is Dickerson AME Church. From Frostburg to Wheeling, West Virginia, then on to Bel Air, which is in Ohio. At both of these places, I found interesting congregations. And traveling to and fro, Bishop Wayman visited several communities in West Virginia. All right. When Douglass speaks in Wheeling in 1884, he is introduced by this gentleman, Dr. Benson Henson Stillyard. He was born in Maryland in 1847, was educated at Howard University in the late 1870s and early 1880s. He attended Howard University's medical school, and he practiced medicine in Wheeling, West Virginia, and he was the first black member of the Wheeling City Council in 1913. And here you can see Mr. Douglass was introduced by Dr. Stillyard, and this speech was at the Opera House, which currently stands today. Built on the site of the original Washington Hall, a second Washington Hall, which was also housed the Grand Opera House, was built in 1877. The new structure was rebuilt in a completely different configuration. I don't know if you're into architectural history, interesting architectural history. The grand opening took place in 1878 and was celebrated with a revival rendition of the play Uncle Tom's Cabin, who the source of Uncle Tom's Cabin, Josiah Henson, actually traveled through Allegheny County on the National Road out to Kentucky. And this building has had several different owners, but this is the current extant building at 12th and Market Street in Wheeling, and that is the little historic marker for Washington Hall that I showed earlier. And there's no historic marker that says Frederick Douglass spoke here on 2 occasions. So if anybody can help us with that, or we would be glad to help you with that. All right. So fast forward, this is kind of an interesting little end note to Mr. Douglass in West Virginia. There was a memoriam book basically published of people sending their condolences to the family. And this is from a pastor in Harper's Ferry that it says, Mr. Douglass had a deep and abiding interest in Storer College. On the day of his death, I received his assurance that he would be one of the lecturers in our anticipated course for the benefit of our church building. And here is from the students, and essentially thanking Mr. Douglass for his great humanity and support of the institution. And then one of his last expressions was in sympathy with Storer College and the assurance of a service that death prevented his rendering. All right, and in closing, Dr. Carter G. Woodson attended Frederick Douglass High School in Huntington, West Virginia in 1895. After serving as a teacher, he went to Berea College, University of Chicago, before earning his Ph.D. in history from Harvard University. He lived on 9th Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., where he passed away in 1950. His home is a National Park Service site. Dr. Woodson, who created Negro History Week, is known as the father of Black History Month, which I read somewhere essentially said it's the most robust historical celebration in the United States, where basically Black History Month, if someone said, what's the most famous history month, say Black History Month. And it was started by West Virginian Dr. Carter G. Woodson. And here's a statue of Dr. Woodson at 9th and Rhode Island Avenue in Northwest. So if you come down to D.C. and take the train from Martinsburg and go to Union Station, take the Green Line to Shaw, and you can walk right over there. And if you have kids kind of go up there and like parents take photos. They're like sitting with Dr. Woodson. And here is a statue of Dr. Woodson on Howell Greer Boulevard in Huntington, which to our friend Hunter is it's a little old school basketball player, but he was an NBA All-Star from West Virginia. All right. And in closing, I don't know if Justin wants to say anything in closing, but I just wanted to thank everyone for being here tonight, for putting up with this a little longer than anticipated presentation. You've had great patience. If you can hear me, clap once. If you can hear me, clap twice. Because that was to wake up anybody taking an early evening nap. All right, so I just wanted to thank all of these various partners and institutions. I don't know if our friend from the newspaper is here, but wanted to thank her. Okay, wonderful. Okay, I didn't see there. Thank you very much for getting the word out. And everybody who came here tonight, I guess with the microphone, if you have questions, maybe just raise your hand, and I guess we can pass the microphone around. Appreciate your patience. Like I said, this is kind of a new emerging history, so it's a little rough around the edges, but we appreciate your patience. It could kind of almost be broken into a longer presentation. And thank you for being here. Justin, I don't know if you want to say anything.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you guys for having us here, and we hope you learned something new about Frederick Douglass, the history of West Virginia, and let's get some, Frederick Douglass trail, throughout America out,
Thank you, guys.
I guess. Maybe we'll enlist Professor Hudgens to be the kind of moderator. If you have a question, just raise your hand. Because we want to get it on the microphone for the recording.
Extra credit. Any questions?
I just have a curiosity. More in a microphone, but I was curious when you mentioned that Frederick Douglass fled the country. Did you know where he went in Europe?
Yes. He initially, the Underground Railroad ran. Oh, sorry. Thank you. Wonderful question. The question was, can you talk about Douglass fleeing the country after being implicated in John Brown's raid? So the Underground Railroad historically ran through Frederick Douglass's house from Rochester basically up to Canada. St. Catharines is relatively close. And so he essentially took that route to Canada, which was beyond extradition laws of the United States. He then went over to Europe and is in England in late 1859, early 1860. He actually wants to go to Paris, but the ambassador, or the American ambassador, would not give him a passport to go to France. And Douglass's youngest daughter, Annie Douglass, actually passed away. And when he heard word of that, that kind of basically came back to help his grieving family. And it's very tragic, actually. Douglass had 21 grandchildren, only 9 lived to adulthood. But he basically went to Canada, then went to England, and he was basically sheltered by the International Abolitionist Network that he had when he spoke there in the 1845, 46. I don't know if anyone else has any questions. I guess shout it out or just raise your hand.
Was his 21 children from one woman?
Well, yeah, well,
21 grandchildren.
okay. Frederick Douglass is. All due respect, every presentation we go, we always get a question. It's a wonderful question, but we always get questioned because we want to, people are interested, obviously, in the personal lives of historical figures. Douglass has a very interesting, personal life that he very deliberately kind of tried to keep his personal life out of public view. Douglass was married to Anna Murray for 44 years. Anna Murray is from the Eastern Shore. They had 5 adult children. Annie Douglass passed away. He had another son, Frederick Douglass Jr., who died in 1892. So Douglass actually outlived 2 of his children, kind of upsetting natural evolution. He had 21 grandchildren. All of those 21 grandchildren were from his 3 children. So essentially, all of his 21 grandchildren had this, Mr. and Mr. Douglass were their grandparents. Same grandparents. And then Douglass, but then just because I can, to prevent to say the next question coming, because no, it's a great question, and I can already tell. Basically, Douglass's second wife Helen Pitts was a white lady who was from an abolitionist family in New York. They were famously married in January of 1884, which in Washington, D.C. was legal. In neighboring Virginia was illegal. I do not know the laws of West Virginia, but Douglass was married to his second wife until his death in 1895, so they were married about 11 years. Helen Pitts Douglass was very instrumental in essentially creating the the nonprofit organization that enabled the National Park Service to open up the Frederick Douglass House in Anacostia on 1411 W Street as a National Park Service. Has anyone been to the Douglass House? Wonderful. Of course you have, Sojourner Truth. That's a professor's now. We're longtime buddies from Frederick Douglass history. Yes, and I mean Douglass was able to make certain, like, let's say, jokes, if you will. Like, basically he said that my first wife was the same, like, I guess ethnicity is not really the word used, but ethnicity or nationality of my mother, and my second wife was of the same ethnicity or ancestry of my father. Douglass never actually knew who his father was in terms of this, well before Ancestry.com or DNA or all these things that they do. Douglass was like a family historian and genealogist. One of the last things that he's working on in his desk in Anacostia is essentially creating a family tree. Douglass was always interested in trying to determine who actually his father was. Douglass was of biracial ancestry. And so Douglass, sometimes when he would address audiences, he would make a comment that I did not come here to make a speech, but I just came here to bring color to the occasion, and only as much color as my master allowed me to have.
It's a little dark.
Okay, well,
Oh, the ladies love Douglass, yeah.
I'm sorry. It's a good question. It's a good question, and I'm not. You didn't hit that. No, you're a good question. Okay. So the question was Douglass a ladies' man? And the good Lord Bird, kind of gets into that, but it gets into it in a very diabolical way in everything where Frederick Douglass was someone who cut, probably a very sharp figure. He's about 6'1". He's a very strong fellow. I mean, he kind of had come up, as like a field hand, et cetera, et cetera. He's a very dynamic, charismatic figure, et cetera. And, my mother is a white lady. My grandmothers are white ladies, so I love white ladies, but white ladies do be doing some Karen sort of stuff. So basically back in the day, what would happen, for example, is, now Douglass was someone who was always very, he was always someone who essentially aligned himself with people who were supporting his causes. For example, Douglass was an advocate. He was a womanist in terms of, he was not a feminist because, he was a womanist in terms that he supported women in all sorts of fields of education, journalism, politics, etc. Like Douglass was an advocate for women's rights in every sort of, let's say, way. Like even Amelia Bloomer, Douglass knew Amelia Bloomer and supported Amelia Bloomer from, liberating women's fashion. That's a whole other thing. So when I say with the white ladies, is Douglass was someone who was not afraid of, let's say, societal scorn of walking arm in arm with white women in public, which the abolitionists actually early on, when Douglass broke with William Lloyd Garrison, tried to insinuate that Douglass had infidelities and affairs and all this other stuff. There was this book called Love Across Color Lines, which insinuates that Douglass had an affair with this German lady who actually committed suicide in Paris, and then she left her estate to Frederick Douglass, which that's a whole interesting story in itself. But there's no evidence that Douglass had any children outside of his marriage to Anna Murray. And when I say what the white ladies were doing, the Karen sort of things, I don't know exactly where this happened, but there was a situation where Douglass is walking down the street, and this young white lady, and I'm probably, meaning well or something. I guess this is before Instagram and YouTube and all this other stuff. But she basically crossed over and the reception line and kissed Mr. Douglass, which that's something that could have inadvertently brought, harm to Mr. Douglass, also harm to the white lady that did that. So there are reports where, in terms of Douglass being a ladies' man, I think that women may have shown Mr. Douglass more, affection than, or I don't know. Douglass was someone who had platonic friends, and maybe ladies wanted to be romantic with Mr. Douglass, and he was, as I can put in the words of Ranger Brittany Hall, who was formerly a ranger at the Douglass House, that's something that, unless there is evidence to the contrary, Mr. Douglass's personal life, I believe, is beyond reproach. So I guess that's a long answer to your question.
The only thing they have evidence of is that this German woman was kind of infatuated with Douglass, and that's about it. They insinuate a lot from there, but there's no actual, evidence that he, ever had any extramarital affairs.
When he traveled in West Virginia, would you say that he was better received than he was, or in other parts of the country? Was he? I don't know. I don't quite know how to phrase it. How was his presence received? I guess more warmly than in
West
other
Virginia
parts.
was friendly to Douglass.
I would say that West Virginia. Thank you. That was a wonderful question. The question was, in terms of Frederick Douglass's travels to other areas, and I would say essentially we'll define West Virginia as the South or the Mountain South in terms of what, how was Frederick Douglass received in, southern areas, southern communities after the Civil War. I mean, it's not exactly what you asked, but I'll answer it that way. So, just in the interest of time, I didn't read like the clip from Martinsburg, when Douglass is in Martinsburg. Actually, I'm not going to go back to it. Douglass specifically says when he's in Martinsburg, for example, in 1879, that, Miss Truth, it was wonderful to see you. I'll talk to you. I'll email you. That's Sojourner Truth. Well, that's her alter ego historically. Professor Snyder. Thank you, Sherry. Thanks for coming. Okay, so when Douglass is in Martinsburg, specifically in 1879, and Lindsay, I can send you the information like to get to a quote if you like. Douglass essentially says that he has traveled all throughout the world. Specifically, he's traveled in Europe, and that he feels that the hospitality that he received in Martinsburg was, just wonderful, and he felt no ill will or grievance, or there were no hecklers, he didn't say it like that language. But basically, when Douglass is received in Martinsburg, he specifically compliments the citizenry, which is both black and white citizens, for the way that he's been greeted. They essentially met him at the train station, which, prior to the Civil War, when Douglass is in communities, essentially like in the North, there's even some stories where basically he goes to a community thinking he's going to be able to speak, and nobody will allow him to stay in the house. So he almost has to sleep out in the public square before he then lectures. Now this is in the North prior to the Civil War. So when Douglass is in Martinsburg, and then he's stays at the Continental Hotel, which I'm sorry I can't speak more informed about the Continental Hotel, but I'm going to presume that the Continental Hotel was probably the leading hotel in Martinsburg, where, for example, Douglass was someone who was on the receiving end of discrimination in many sort of instances, like I guess kind of Jim Crowed would be the term, where he wouldn't be able to sit, have accommodations on hotels, restaurants, streetcars, steamships, and this is like basically throughout his public career. Douglass is in Indiana, Wisconsin one time, and he wants to eat in like the main dining room, and they say you can't eat in the dining room, you can eat like basically in the bar. And then so Douglass is in the bar, it's all loud, people are drinking and stuff like that. And Douglass basically says, I thought the citizens of this town would have the same humanity that the horses do, because I saw outside a black and white horse drinking from the same trough. So anyway, so when Douglass said that, then everybody laughed, and then Douglass was seen into the main seating room, and they apologized. So with that said, and then when Douglass is in Wheeling, West Virginia in 1867, Mr. Campbell specifically kind of essentially says he's my special guest of honor. Mr. Campbell was well respected within the community, ran the newspaper. So Douglass kind of had these, I don't want to say chaperones or sponsors, but essentially hospitality committees when he visited West Virginia, which he usually would have those in different communities. And then when he's in Parkersburg in 1873, he's there with the sitting United States Senator, former, first governor of the state. So he's with essentially very, very prominent, West Virginians, people beyond reproach, where if there was any maybe, animosity or hostility towards him, it probably wouldn't have been voiced, let's say, like publicly, because he's in company with the kind of these leading citizens, if you will. Like essentially, they're like putting their arm around Douglass and saying, he's my friend, so he's a friend to our community, that sort of thing. In Wheeling in 1884, there's a little bit of reports of like Douglass kind of like sometimes would like argue with the crowd. And so with that said, the answer is that West Virginia, just like everyone has been here this evening, has been very welcoming and hospitable and has now sat through almost an hour and a half of discursive history. Douglass would basically speak for like 2 hours. This is before you had microphones or AV equipment. And so the short answer, Lindsay, is that I think West Virginia was a place that Mr. Douglass would have ranked very high on his, Yelp review of places that he had visited. And from all accounts I can determine, Douglass never had any. There were some incidents that he had mostly before the Civil War, but also after the Civil War, where there was like open hostility or all sorts of issues and things. And from what I can determine, he did not have any of those kind of acrimonious experiences in West Virginia. That was a wonderful question. All right, we got a couple more minutes. No, it's what, 6:30? So we have a couple more moments. If anybody wants to make any comments, questions, critiques, Justin and I would be glad to talk about Randy Moss and Jason Williams, if you'd like. Yes. Yes, ma'am.
Now, I've heard the book is better than the movie.
Yeah,
than the television series.
Yeah, just for a little bit of clarity, James McBride is a novelist or a fiction writer. I personally think he does good work, and I've listened to interviews. He wrote actually a book called Song Yet Sung, which is about essentially the Eastern Shore and Patty Cannon, who was kind of like this legendary, like slave kidnapper. She's kind of a very
Torturous, treacherous. Yeah.
Justice said, Patty Cannon is like what is the like the Grimm brothers? What is it called? Not the negative fairy tale. Yeah. But James McBride is someone who I respect the work that he has done. He wrote a book called The Good Lord Bird, which, in all honesty, is essentially a farce.
Exactly. It's not meant to be it's not meant to be. You guys can hear me. It's not meant to be a historical piece. It's more of a revisionist take on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Good Lord Bird is essentially, I would almost say, like a farcical, more than a.
We have more problem with it because of the history of John Brown not being explored prior to them taking the liberties with the history. That's kind of what we maybe have an issue with. Yeah,
and the liberties they take with Mr. Douglass, I mean, I don't even really know how to properly describe it, but essentially, they like insinuate that. I'm not going to say the language. They just insinuate that he was a very untoward personal character, and I guess like the word lush.
A Three's Company type situation.
Yeah, and they also insinuate in that, I believe that they insinuate that Douglass was like, that Douglass consumed alcohol and let the alcohol.
Douglass was a man of temperance,
Douglass was someone who might have a small glass of wine at dinner if you invited to your house, and one of his favorite meals would be Maryland beaten biscuits and fried chicken. So when he came over the Potomac, he might have stopped at Grandma's fried chicken and got some pieces. Yeah. But anyway, so the Good Lord Bird insinuates it's just very troubling to watch it from a historical perspective because it almost kind of makes fun of Frederick Douglass, which I don't necessarily know that was James McBride's like really point, but then when it was made into the HBO or Showtime little series, it just was, like I said, from Mr. McNeil and I, Justin and I had a hard time kind of watching that. Yeah, distasteful would be the right word.
I have one more question, one more thing to say. Store College. I don't know that I can probably find this out, but who is Store College named for?
That's a wonderful question. The question was, who is Store College named for? Store College's namesake is John Storer. John Storer was a businessman, philanthropist from Maine. Maine is where Bowdoin College is where Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain of kind of Gettysburg fame was at Little Round Top, Big Round Top. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain went to Bowdoin. General Oliver Otis Howard went to Bowdoin before going to West Point. Bowdoin was another college like Oberlin, Ohio, that was co-ed and integrated very early on. John Brown Russworm, who started essentially the first black newspaper in the United States, graduated from Bowdoin in like the 1820s. So Maine historically was kind of a very, I guess, had kind of very progressive philanthropists, and so
You would have a lot of the teachers in the freedmen schools would be, from the Maine, New England area coming down south to, fill the roles as teachers in these schools.
yeah. So and essentially, the educated young lady teachers from up north, they were supportive of the Freedmen's Bureau, and they did not have misgivings about teaching black students, et cetera. I'm sure it was, challenging, just like, teaching today is challenging, et cetera. But anyway, so John Storer was someone who, Bates College was affiliated with the Free Will Baptists. Frederick Douglass spoke at Bates on, I believe, 2 different occasions. It's in Lewiston, Maine. So there was like this network that Douglass was affiliated with in Maine where people were essentially able to put their heads together and say, okay, we need an appropriation to kind of jumpstart this institution to move beyond just kind of like a one-room schoolhouse. And really, Storer College's initial classrooms were the Lockwood House, which for those of you familiar with Harpers Ferry, the Lockwood House is right by the cemetery. The Lockwood House is where General Sheridan uses his headquarters when the Union kind of went through the Shenandoah. And so following the Civil War, these government buildings were not used, and several politicians were able to transfer the ownership from essentially the government annexed property to Storer College, and then they kind of put their heads together and appealed to John Storer of Maine, and he said, I will donate $10,000 if $10,000 can be met or matched, just like today when they do like grants, like there's kind of matching grants. So he donated $10,000 under the condition that $10,000 could be raised privately. And I don't know the whole history, but the $10,000 was able to be raised privately. And then so Mr. Storer gave his $10,000, and then I don't think Mr. Storer lived very longer after the formation of Storer College. Senator Fessenden, which Justin probably knows from Fessenden Street in Washington, D.C. Mr. Fessenden was a senator from Maine, and he, I believe, kind of helped to initiate that contact with John Storer. So it's a long answer, but a wonderful question.
You have another question over here in the corner?
You mentioned what happened to Storer College. And most of the students assimilated into what's Virginia Union University, one of the HBCUs in Richmond, Virginia now. So it is still in operation, and there's a hall there that's called Storer Hall.
I didn't know that. I did not know that. I've never heard that. I didn't know that. We gotta check that out.
The comment was that, as I understand, Storer College's last graduating class was 1955, and when Storer College essentially closed up, that the students, faculty matriculated to Virginia Union, which is in Richmond, right? Or is it Virginia Union Seminary? No?
That's a separate school, but
Okay.
Union University is a college.
Okay. And that's it's a guy that played for the Wizards, Terry Davis, who went to Virginia Union University. So yeah, okay, and I did not know that. Our friend here said that the faculty, students, resources that were left with Storer College were essentially moved over to Richmond, Virginia, and on the present-day campus of Virginia Union University, there is a Storer Hall, which I did not know that. I've never heard that nor read that. That's fascinating. See, because at Harpers Ferry, they do such a horrible job of presenting the history of Storer College. I've never known that. So thank you very much. I should say horrible. It's a little underwhelming, but I have a long-standing issue with that. That's really fascinating. I did not know that. Never heard that before. That's wonderful. That's great. Okay, you guys have been a wonderful audience. If you have any last comments, questions, comments, shout them out. Please sign the sign-in sheet. Wanted to once again thank Professor Caitlin Hudgens. Thank all of her students who are reading Frederick Douglass. Thank all local historians, everyone with questions, comments. get home safely. You don't have to go home, but I think you have to get out of here by 8 o'clock. I don't know. I have like 1 or 2 copies of this book. I don't know. I'd be glad to sign it for you if you like, or sell it to you. I don't have Cash App, and the Wi-Fi might not work, but I can work something out. But anyway, you guys have been a wonderful audience. Justin and I sincerely thank you, and everyone at Potomac State College. And we hope to see you soon, and have a wonderful holiday and rest of your year.